So he continues in 6 with a similar sort of thought. He says, for him who has conquered his self, the self is his friend, but for him who has not conquered his self, the self verily becomes hostile, like an enemy. Okay, so if you look at the text here, you've got some lowercase self and some uppercase self. So for him who has conquered his mind, shall we say, just to make it easier to understand, for him who has conquered his mind, the self is his friend, but for him who has not conquered his mind, the self verily becomes hostile, like an enemy. So what it's saying here, it is somewhat paradoxical again, because we have understood the self to be neutral, right? So we use that example of petrol in a car. Whatever the activities, functions, and directions that the car takes, the petrol is neutral with regards to all of those things. And so we say the self is neutral. Self does not think, self does not feel, self does not act. The self is that subject within which permits thinking, feeling, and action. And so, but here he says it's hostile, like an enemy. Here he says it's like a friend. So if you look at the text more clearly, he says his self is his friend and like an enemy. So one is to directly say the self is a friend, and the other is to say it's like an enemy. Right, so this is the analogy that we can use to understand this. If you have the sun above and you have a pool of water in front of you, when the pool of water is perfectly calm, you would say the sun is undisturbed, the sun is clear, the sun is, whatever word you want to use. When the water is rippled or agitated, you would say the sun appears scattered, the sun appears fragmented, the sun appears weak. Right? So you say the sun is strong, clear, in still water, because that's what it is. It's reflecting its true nature. When you see a scattered sun, you recognize that it's not a reflection of the sun's nature, it's a reflection of the nature of the equipments, of the water. So in the same way, when we have controlled the equipments, what that means is that we see the self in its true light. We see the self as that, he uses that phrase, the abode of bliss, the solace, the calmness, the sense of completeness, of completion, of safety, all of those positive things. So when we have controlled the little self, then the capital self appears to us as it is in its state of bliss. But when we have not controlled the self, we're not seeing the self as it is, we're seeing it through the equipments. And so when we see it through the disturbed equipments, the self seems to us disturbed. And so that's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing a scattered, fragmented, agitated, disturbed self. You're seeing the self reflected through the imperfect equipments. And so when the mind is agitated, you see agitation. So the self, so in a sense, you are seeing the self in the same way that you're seeing the sun through this on disturbed water, but you're not seeing the sun as it really is. You're seeing the nature of the water is what you're really seeing. In the same way, you are seeing the self in that sense, in the sense that you can only experience yourself, but conditioned by the equipments. So you're not seeing the self as it is, you're seeing the conditioned self. And that's the state of agitation, of limitation. Hence, it's like an enemy. The self is like an enemy. It's not actually an enemy. The sun appears fragmented. The sun is not fragmented. But if you look at the calm water, you say that the sun is circular. Well, that's true. The sun is circular. The sun appears fragmented. There's the difference. So it's giving the indication of the nature of the self, as it were, through this verse, and indicating that what we experience is a result of our own mastery over the equipments. And again, this is the role and the direction of self-development. So self-development is increasing mastery over our equipments, which I believe he Yeah, he brings in the next verse. So yeah, even to say the self is a friend is wrong, but we have to use language to try and convey something. And so this is why it says, it's interesting that this verse, he says the self is a friend and like an enemy. Both of them are taken together to indicate one particular point. To say the self is a friend, that would be a lot more confusing. But say the self is a friend but like an enemy is giving more information, is giving a much more complete picture. So to say the self is a friend is strictly wrong, but it's saying something that is strictly speaking incorrect in order to try to convey something else. Although it might in and of itself be incorrect, it's still instructive. It's a useful fiction, you might say. And also remember, this text is poetry. And so there's a lot of literary devices that are employed, like all poetry, to convey meaning. So they don't have to be prosaic. They don't have to be logical in the imagery and the devices that are presented. There is logic. That means based on logic, the whole thing. But the way that it's conveyed, use images, use symbols, use devices, use language techniques. They use direct contradictions. That is near, that is far. Which one is it, near or far? You know? And so the contradictions, the poetry, the devices are all used to convey something else. And that's where it becomes an intellectual exercise. The self is a friend. How can we say the self is a friend? Because it's neutral. A friend is someone who has a positive relationship with you. What can it be trying to say? Well, read the rest of the verse. It is a friend, it's like an enemy. So maybe it's trying to convey such and such. So while it is strictly speaking wrong to say the self is a friend, in the context of the text and the context of the discussion, it's still instructive for us. The self is the abode of satisfaction when you've controlled your equipments. But when you haven't, the self appears to you as mental agitation. What does the self appear to you like? What does your own self appear to you like when you've controlled your equipments, when you're in bliss? What does the self appear to you like when you are caught up in the external world and caught up in your equipments? It appears to you like misery. Your own experience, your own subjective experience is a miserable one, because you're viewing your experiences through the disturbed equipments. So again, remember that it's a poetic device. It's not trying to convey the idea that the self is in relationship with you. It's just trying to convey a point about the way that we experience our own lives under two different circumstances. One, when you've conquered your little self, and one when you haven't conquered your little self. But what it does is it draws that distinction from the perspective of the capital self. It says that it keeps coming back to the self as the source of all of your experiences. So it uses that as the basis. So it says yourself is a friend, yourself is like an enemy.